reality. And for us, God himself as Trinity is this perfect unity and multiplicity. He in himself, the Father generates the Son and inspires the Spirit, and then there's this communion of love. So already in God himself, there is this this self-giving. There is this unity of identity and difference, because there is a unity, there is an identity in the difference. The three persons of the Trinity are fully mutually interior to one another. So I would just wonder, like what would be your reason for rejecting this understanding of the absolute? Like this is kind of the equivalent of the one for us, even though we would say, following Pseudo Dionysius and others, that the essence of God, what God is incomprehensible, but who God is, this has been revealed to us as Trinity. So just wrap my point up, you when you're talking about how the one gives generates, for lack of a more precise term, generates multiplicity below it, it's almost like the one isn't complete in itself, so it requires something. There's almost like a necessity of creation problem here that we don't like. Traditionally, we haven't fallen into that, because God is already perfect in his Trinitarian communion. He already meets the criteria of inner perfection in and through his sacrificial perfection, which you were talking about. So that already occurs in God, instead of it having the one and then the one having to generate lower levels of being. So what's your general take on the Trinity, and why like, I know you call yourself a Christian, but you're not a Trinitarian, so you actually wouldn't meet the criteria of a Christian according to the Orthodox Church, but you clearly see something in Christ, and there definitely are overlaps. Like, I've talked with other Platonists, and they kind of gave a different picture of than what you were talking about. Like, I've never heard about this perfection needing to go beyond itself to perfect others. So yeah, what's your view on the Trinity?
Right. Well, I mean, the three persons of the Trinity, the Greek language there is hypostasis.
Hypostasis, yeah.
So many people in late antiquity associated the three hypostases that Plotinus talks about with the three persons of the Trinity. And there's a school of thought that that is the original sense of the term hypostasis in the Christian tradition, and that it became more of a personalistic concept later. I don't know the historical veracity of that for
I
sure,
don't think so.
but
Yeah, I don't think so, because of the Cappadocian fathers, who kind of, they're the ones who really developed this, and they're fourth century. So I think Christians have been personalists for since the beginning,
why do they
personally.
use the term hypostasis for person?
Actually, I would, if you want to look into this, you can find a PDF of John Zizulis's book Being as Communion online. The first chapter, he talks about the development of the term, both the term prosopon, which is person, or mask in Greek theater, and then
Mm-hmm.
how hypostasis came around. And his whole argument is that before the Cappadocian fathers, especially, but I mean the Christians in particular, the or Christians in general, the notion of person never had, like, there never was this absolute value to the person. Like for like prosopon meant mask in Greek. So there was like this idea
Right.
that there was like there wasn't like an absolute value. There's something like fake about it, something inauthentic. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Like for the
yeah,
mystery religions, probably personhood was something to be overcome,
right.
you know,
And do you
in,
take that position?
in
You
the
do, right?
sense, I mean, there are different senses of personhood. So I guess to answer that, I'd have to get at why did they start using the term hypostasis, and what is the difference between the original uh mask concept of personhood and this other concept, because I don't know if that's there in the Greek literature otherwise, using hypostasis to mean this term person. So yeah, if you
Um,
could just explain that historically, why did they start using hypostasis, and what's the definitional change there that happened?
Well, I think hypostasis wasn't used to refer to mask. I'm pretty
No,
sure.
right, it wasn't.
Hypostasis kind of meant hypostasis, and from my understanding, hypostasis and ousia were basically used synonymously. I've heard that, like
Similar, yeah.
similar, right? So it wasn't. I don't think it was really until the Nicene Council where there was that, like, the the distinction between ousia and hypostasis referred to person. And I think, I'm not exactly sure, like I I'm not that well read on the history of it, but I'm not exactly sure why they ended up using the term hypostasis and defining it the way they did.
It's
But
just
I
weird because it's exactly in that time period they started using this term when it was a technical term within Platonism. Also,
mm,
a lot of the Christians during that time were Platonists, like bishops
yeah,
studied
yeah,
Neoplatonism. And even like one of them, I forget the name, I was just looking into this guy. He like said, okay, I'll be a bishop in the church, but I still believe in the eternity of the world, the
mm,
created world, that is, and various other like Neoplatonic doctrines. So
okay,
the fact that the traditions were so tightly enmeshed, and then they use this Neoplatonic technical term in a Neoplatonic, well, actually, it's not quite the Neoplatonic sense. Anyway, it's the history there, I think, is very ambiguous.
yeah,
And in any case, if there was an influence from Neoplatonism onto Christianity regarding the notion of the three hypostases, the three persons, then it would basically mean that the one has a counterpart in the intelligible, that is ousia, being itself the principle, the kind of form of forms within the realm of forms. Sometimes the one is called like the form of forms. Uh, there's a lack of like clarity in the technical language here because we're speaking English and not Greek.
yeah,
But basically, the correspondence is the one would be like the role of the father, more or less.
mm,
The principal form in the realm of forms would be like the logos, would be like the son,
yeah,
and then the world soul would be like the Holy Spirit.
mm,
And it doesn't line up perfectly because the world soul is suke and spirit is pneuma, and there's like that's a marked difference in the New Testament, to kind of let go of the suke and embrace the pneuma more or less. But there's also the pneuma within Platonism as well. And so there would, within like the pneumatic realm, there would be a principal member. This is the notion of the serai, divine series, where from the one there's a row kind of moving straight down through the hierarchies that is the most principally divine, right? The truest embodiment of the one at each level. That same thing would apply to the other aspects of unity as well, though. So you would have not just father, son, to use the Christian language, and spirit in that column, but you would have like the aspect of unity that is that of the guardian, like kind of like the Athena imagery, that which guards and unites in that sense. And then you would have the corresponding notion of guardianship in the realm of forms, and a corresponding like guardian soul that actually acts in the world to affect this at its own level. So I think the hypostases and the notion of the divine serai map fairly well onto the Christian notion of the Trinity, because like the Godhead is not restricted to the first hypostasis in a certain sense, because we do identify the manifestations of a particular divine series here with its ultimate source. Like Proclus talks about in the myths, in the Greek myths, when we have an apparition of Zeus, Zeus comes here and does something. It's not the Henatic Zeus, like the principal Zeus that actually manifests in the world and does things. It's more like a daimonical apparition or a spirit that itself is in that divine series. So what we make contact with, I mean, it's also sort of similar to the essence energy distinction. You're not making contact with the essence of Zeus for Proclus. It's a generated being, which is distinct from the energies of God are not generated, of course, in Orthodoxy. And maybe this term, again, it's an English technical term that might not map perfectly onto what Proclus would have meant, but In any case, it is something in the series of that Henadic Zeus that we actually make contact with.
Right.
So I have no problem with the Trinitarian language. I mean, I think of the Father basically in the image of the One, the Son as that kind of presiding principle of order of the cosmos, not restricted to the cosmos, transcending, but also indwelling in the cosmos. And then the Holy Spirit, I mean, it does make sense to me that there would be this, like, because there are different spiritual motions, of course, and one is going to be in that principal divine series that like deserves the most honor, respect, worship, and should be followed, right? So I have no problem with the Trinitarian. The problem is for me that like the technical Orthodox or Catholic language around the Trinity is like non-philosophical. And so ultimately, like it's just a bunch of, to my mind, to my perspective, it's just a bunch of words. Because the Catholic Church will like say, you have to believe this, this, and this about the Trinity, these particular predicates, but like you can't define them. You're saying it's beyond human reason. So like, what exactly am I even believing? So I don't know. I don't know whether, I could be called a Trinitarian fairly or not, but that's kind of, yeah.
Well,
and then the personhood notion, I'm still interested in like
yeah.
exactly what's meant by
Yeah.
hypostasis in the Orthodox Church and Catholicism for that matter.
Right. Well, for us, there is a certain sense in which you can't define a person in intellectual terms, and I think this has to do with this kind of has to do with our rejection of uh, certain, I would say, Platonist influence notions of the beatific vision, and by us I mean the Orthodox, because there's a certain sense in which it transcends unity with God, transcends the intellect precisely because he's a person. So what you know of God is him as a person. So it's like a personal encounter between us and God. And for us, there's a certain irreducibility of a personal encounter in the same way there's an irreducibility of the person to anything that you could point out, like for example in your debate with Jay a few years back, you were talking about how you were influenced a lot by Tegmark, and you were an information reductionist. I don't know if you still are, but then Jay asks you, well, we're persons and we're talking to each other. So how would you fit in the person within an information theory of reality? And I mean, I would have the same question, because for me, the problem with the notion of personhood and why it's difficult is I think there you can't describe it because you can't circumscribe what a person is. You can't have because a person is absolute image of God, eternal.
Right.
So what you can't do is define and circumscribe a person, but what you can do is experience the person through a personal relationship.
Actually, I do have an answer to that now. So
okay, sure.
So basically, I'm an information reductionist in physics, but physics is not the ultimate reality. That's in the world of generation.
Right.
So if hypostasis is taken to be that substrate of existence, then for things here, the soul, like the hyparxis or summit of the soul, is in that hypostasis of soul. So if that's the sense of personality transcending information, I have no problem with that. The principle of the soul, what gives the soul its unity, is beyond information, but that's because soul is beyond the generated world. So the physical world may reduce to information, but that doesn't mean that levels beyond physics don't actually come down and influence things here.
Sure. And so where would you fit the person? Like, because for us, like me as a, like, to use kind of, I guess, psychological language, like me as an ego, like a person, a center of consciousness in Christianity, I will continue to exist eternally. Like I was created, and then because God is perfect in himself, and for us, God is like, and you say this too about the one, like God is beyond eternity. God is super essential, right? So eternity for us is well, time for us is and I remember Jay, like in your debate, he was like, "Oh, time, the philosophy, theology of time is really difficult in orthodoxy," and actually, it is kind of hard to explain to people who aren't familiar with it. But there, God is in eternity. He created us into time. Like the heavens were created perfect, and then earth, the world, was formless and void, and the purpose of uh of God's plan for creation is to unite the heavens with the earth, and then that is that is the eschaton. That's us entering into eternity, and eternity is a personal relationship with God, a direct experience with God, because time for us is the interval of waiting between acts of love. So, and by love, we just mean like procession and reversion towards, like movement towards the other, and the others return back. God is eternal because the Father, Son, there's no distance in the relationship of love between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They're perfectly mutually interior. So we're meant to become by grace deified, which is to say we enter into the Trinitarian communion, not by nature, but by grace, and we are deified. So in that sense, us as persons will remain in eternity. We will enter into this communion, and we will remain eyes, like concrete, distinct individual persons, but will be united fully with God and with others in the sense of full mutual interiority, where there's essentially this perfect no more distance, of perfect unity between people while remaining distinct. So this is like a classic like unity and distinction unity and distinction idea that we affirm. So where does the person begin, like, because like you said, the person can't be reduced to information, but where exactly does it begin? And I guess like my another question would be like, the one can't be personal. Like I guess you can't believe in a God with a face, can you? Like you can't believe in a God who has a personality and is a person, in the sense that we could talk to, like we could pray, like we can pray to God who is the one for us, but I don't know if you would be praying to the one, if that even makes sense, since I don't think the notion of person would apply at that level of reality.
Yeah, I think again, we're dealing with this ambiguity about the concept of the hypostasis. The terms that you use to describe personality, like an ego or like a center of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
in Carl Jung's sense, he would define that as the self, and the persona he would use more in that sense of the mask, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, as you're describing it, it seems like you're talking about the kind of self with the capital S, exactly as Carl Jung uses it. So I mean, if that's the case, you know, ultimately I do tend still towards a kind of Advaita Vedanta perspective here, kind of at the highest level, but
Mm-hmm.
there's some subtlety here because I do think there's an eternal existence of souls, and souls are distinct. So I
Right.
don't think that the soul blends into the one and dissipates. But at the same time, um, the hyparxis of the soul goes. So before I said it was kind of rooted in the hypostasis of soul. That's oversimplifying it. Ultimately, like the extreme summit of the soul reaches into the realm of intellect, nous. That's why we have intellects, right? Because that the soul is suspended from the realm of forms, ultimately, and obviously those forms, like if you keep zooming in to the summit of the soul and what is most like what is closest to the center of our being and identity, first we go, well, the soul is us, sort of, basically, and then like within us, we are grounded in intelligible principles, our intellect, which is the summit of our own being as our soul. But then within that, like you keep going to the summit of intellect, and eventually you have to get back to the one, which grants the unity for all things.
Mm.
And so what makes the intellect in us one? What gives it reality fundamentally? It is the one. And yet, qua its our participation in it as our particular soul, we are in kind of a particular Hanatic series. We are making contact with a particular aspect of unity. But even there is this kind of if you go beyond that, still everything terminates back in the one. But it's problematic to talk about the one in relational terms, insofar as the one, like at its summit, is kind of transcendent of relationship with, as like via without. I don't know how to put this exactly, but the one, like, you can't say that here's the one and here's all other things,
Right.
and there are these fixed indefinite relationships that persist for all time, because then the one is not absolute. The one is not like ultimate in some sense, because its definition of like what it is and where it is contextual. It has to do with where all these other beings are that it relates to. From like the one's perspective, there isn't anything but it. And yet from our perspective, there is this distinction between like the summit of our being as one transcendent and in a sense other than us, insofar as we're in that relation with it. But like for the one, it's sort of like for God, all things are good type deal. Like for the one, there is only what's already within it. And there is this principle in Platonism, and it, made explicit by Proclus, that there's causal containment, where everything that's real in lower levels is there seminally and causally in the higher level. So the one contains the multiplicity of all real beings in some sense, and so then contains like us individually, which does look like this mutual communion. I mean, as far as I can tell, Orthodox theology was derived from Neoplatonism. I mean, that's kind of how it looks to me, and I do see these similarities now as I've learned more about Neoplatonism and more about Orthodoxy since that encounter with Jay. But yeah, so I mean, did that kind of answer?
Yeah, no.
I want to qualify one more thing.
Sure.
So this is not explicit in Neoplatonism or in Plato himself. There are only hints at the idea. But the question is whether, like, in our cycle of reincarnation, which Platonists do believe in, whether we are kind of consigned to always identify with our particular soul, or in some sense, if we can transcend time as ourself, as our center of identification, like what are we fundamentally identifying with? Is it possible to kind of transcend out of the realm of soul through intellect all the way back to the one? Can we return to the one fully? This kind of henosis idea, where we would no longer be like, I wouldn't be any more Eric than you are Trey. Like at that point, I would, if full-on henosis took place, it would be kind of all of these identities would be brought into a total unity. Although again, not a cataphatically simple thing, but unity as far as, what the excellences that we see in unified things here, that to like the asymptotic extension of the concept beyond our, ability to actually make it intellectually clear.
Right.
So, but anyway, but that's really not clear. And Proclus even seems to indicate that like you are kind of fatalistically consigned always to cycle in this particular soul. And I would make sense of that by saying like the existence of the soul as one thing in reality, like that will cycle forever, no matter what. But like, is that really the self? Is that who you really are? In the first Alcibiades, Plato uses some language in the voice of Socrates that's a little ambiguous, but he basically like distinguishes between ourselves as the soul, and he hints beyond that and says like, are we even the soul, or are we the itself, or something along that lines, reminiscent of like, I am that I am, So that's not clear whether they're, Neoplatonists could accept the full-on henosis, like absolute unity with the one, as far as that's conceivable, or if more of a theosis similar to the Orthodox concept is truer. Again, I still lean towards the Advaita Vedanta henosis concept.
Right.